Hello, this is Mad Cat, and welcome to another edition of Mad Cat Smash Feminism. Rah! Still a little early in the morning right now. I don't want to go full vocal, but honestly, this is not so much smashing feminism as it is ruining trigger warnings. And I'm doing so through a paper written by Harry Chu, not Arthur Chu, Harry Chu. Harry Chu. Choo 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 choo. Sorry, that's disrespectful. And this paper is basically about trigger warnings in the college classroom setting and their importance for that. I should load up YouTube real quick. Now, this paper came to me as someone wanted to just say, hey, look at this. This is all strange and all of that. And I found the report and I'm like, whoa, there's just a lot here. And a lot of it is bullshit, in all honesty. So I wanted to go ahead and do a video discussion on it. Hold on, I'm loading this up. Okay, got voice going. Go ahead and put the chat up. All right, so a lot of this is bullshit, and today's chapter will really show the problems that this paper has as we discuss the evidence for it. Now, it was brought to my attention that someone in one of the groups that I talk in told me that this paper was initially kind of like poking fun at trigger warnings, and that the author, who's studying to be in biology, mostly did it as a practice for how to do academia papers. But apparently, as he looked more and more into it, he became convinced that it was necessary. But I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's what was told to me. So before we get started, I do want to say that with how YouTube has done things, I no longer am monetizing my videos. I guess YouTube is trying to do that, so it'll convince me to stop making videos. Well, the joke's on YouTube. I've never made enough on YouTube to warrant any sort of payment whatsoever. So, that doesn't stop me from making videos. I love making videos. I love interacting with my fans. You can still donate to my Patreon. And that's why I do these videos, especially because I do get money from my Patreon and I want to earn that. So that's why I, really push myself to do this hard work for you. So let me close out of this and we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and do a screen share real quick. There we go. Now, I apologize for the last video. I just kind of cut out at the end of chapter 2. We're only going to do like chapter 3 for today because it's a pretty long chapter. So I didn't get to finish chapter 2, but I'm going to go ahead and finish this real quick. It's only one page, but it's some pertinent information here. Now, Arthur Chu, not Arthur Chu, why do I keep doing that? Harry Chu. Harry Chu basically said that, all of this is, yes, go away. Swear I need to turn that off altogether. All right, so he basically said that we find trigger warnings in humanities, but not sciences. And he then gives us a survey about Ohio University that out of 250 students, only 11% were familiar with the term trigger warning. And these were medical students. 11% were familiar with them. And after an explanation of them, 31% supported the use of trigger warnings, 40% were on the fence, and about 30% were against it. I'm sure if that 40% were given a proper explanation of it, I mean that given both sides of it by two people, one who feels that should be done and one who strongly doesn't, and sees a debate on the two, that number would then go towards against, especially if it read some of the evidence found in this paper. And yes, I agree that some might go towards um, the side of supporting trigger warnings, but I think when people really understand what's happening here, people would be against it. Now, Stallman in 2017 suggests that the impact of avoiding distressing material may amount to a loss of learning opportunity for art students. That's fair. But students from health disciplines who miss critical and often potentially disturbing material may be inadequately equipped to navigate complex, high-stress situation in patient care. And that's the main argument against these trigger warnings is, I mean, a lot of this is saying, well, trigger warnings are not meant to be used as a way to avoid a lesson. It's meant to allow people to properly engage in them. And yet, so far, they have been used to silence professors. They've been used to get some discussions thrown out of the classroom. And when we're talking about patient care, when we're talking about the medical system, when we're talking about engineering or mathematics or, the law, these have almost every class is going to be critical. Every discussion is going to be critical. So you can't just have the opinion, oh, I will skip this lecture because it's triggering. No, I mean, even if you do decide to skip it and somehow make it up, you didn't go through that. What's going to happen when you get into the real world and, say you work for a law firm and the law firm is like, oh, well, we have to do some pro bono work for tax reasons, and you need to defend this person who's a rapist. It's like, oh, well, that's triggering me. And it's like, well, either you do it or you're fired. I mean, it probably wouldn't do that, but I mean, do you think you'll get any promotions if you're not willing to do something? And not having dealt with those high stressful situations in college doesn't prepare you for the real world. Now, Rebecca Stringer, a gender studies professor, surprise, surprise there, who teaches a course on critical victimology at Otago University, suggests that students at Otago who have been requesting trigger warnings in other disciplines have been doing it, and they're more likely to gain exposure to the concept of trigger warnings in gender studies. Yeah, you've kind of made the case for us. People who take gender studies will be exposed to trigger warnings and then use trigger warnings in other disciplines. So, yeah, it's propaganda right there. It's a class that teaches how to be a victim, especially when your class is critical victimology. Yeah, I'm sure you're very critical on that one. Springer attributes this to gender studies as a discipline that doesn't strive to maintain a tradition of disciplinary masculine forged in tweed and emotionless rationality. So, the way of teaching students, which is based on facts, logic, taking emotions out of it, you're against that. You want it to be highly chaotic, emotional, and based on feelings of what we feel is true and not necessarily what is concrete. Stringer goes on to suggest that when we view the issue of trigger warnings from the equality of access to education perspective, The discipline of gender studies stands to facilitate the implementation of trigger warnings across all disciplines. So, in other words, when we look at it as how can people victimize themselves and then use trigger warnings, then it allows the students to get the professors to teach that the way they want to, and thus make it easier on them so they can pass. Yeah, we're going to be raising a generation of idiots. They're going to not get the proper education. They'll teach their children and set a lower expectation. By that time, trigger warning should be in high school, junior high, and elementary school. So sad. So Chu states, for the time being, though, it appears that outside of humanities, a sizable number of academics and students in sciences and health-related fields have yet to be exposed to the concept of trigger warnings, warnings in practice, and questions related to the efficacy. Again, dude, Oxford comma, look into it. That's the only breath of fresh air that I have in this, is that only those within humanities, and specifically those who take gender studies, are exposed to trigger warnings, and that this is not more commonplace. But the moment it becomes more commonplace, it will not only be used by social justice warriors trying to control the lecture, but it'll be used by all sorts of students who want to either try to get an easier grade or just avoid classroom conduct altogether and go off and party, go off and do whatever. All right, so now let's get to the third chapter. Where is the evidence? And right away, he says, currently, research cited in trigger warning conversation are merely supporting or refuting the assumption of trigger warnings. See, this is where he's got you. So far, you've read this and it's like, okay, he's made some valid points on both sides. But now, right away, when he talks about the evidence of trigger warnings, he's saying that all research has been done in support of the assumption of trigger warnings. And rather than say, here's the evidence, what are your conclusions on it? He's not doing that. He wants you right away to question any and all things that support the current understanding of trigger warnings, that it's more closely associated with trauma, and that students, there really isn't a place for students to have trigger warnings in the classroom. I mean, in some cases it might be possible, but even then, a a psychiatrist would tell someone who has trigger warnings to learn to deal with them, to not expect the world to change around you. And yet this narrative is trying to tell students that if you don't like something, complain about it until you get what you want. So, Rob Whitley, an assistant professor at McGill University, Department of Psychiatry and Research at Douglas Hospital Research Center, suggests that a review of the psychiatric literature yields no studies that demonstrate the effect of trigger warnings on short or long-term mental health outcomes. Okay, maybe some research needs to be done on that, but not by these feminist retards, or I guess femtards, not by these femtards, because, and as this document will demonstrate, they will start with a conclusion. Hey, we need trigger warnings in the classroom. Let's work backwards. Unfortunately, if anyone's going to do research on them, it's most likely them. Similarly, studies on the efficacy of trigger warnings in the classroom have not been published thus far. Boysen. VATS contends that when it comes to trigger warning, appeals to mental health are predictions given the lack of empirical evidence demonstrating the effect, if any effect of trigger warnings on a measurable mental health outcomes. Now, together, these perspectives highlight the absent and need for empirical evidence showing their efficacy of trigger warnings on students' mental health outcomes. And see, here's where I disagree with them. While we might be lacking research in these concepts here, what effects does um, someone who has triggers from trauma, how does that affect them on their day-to-day life? How does that affect them, on the long term? And whether or not having trigger warnings really helps them heal from the trauma that they had. I would argue no, it doesn't, but it would be interesting to research that, and I'd be open for that. But the problem is that he's saying, well, we have people having trigger warnings in classrooms now. So now we need to understand the importance of whether or not those trigger warnings are helping students. Again, you're attacking a symptom. Why is it now, in the last 3 years, have trigger warnings become prevalent in our society? In the first world, does trigger warnings become so important? And the entire span of human history before that, which was much bloodier than it is now, how is it that no one had trigger warnings in all of that time when it comes to learning? But now, right now, we do. Where's the disconnect? And maybe we should figure out what's causing that. And I'm sure we can come up with something, but research should be done on what's causing that problem and see if we can prevent it so students can get back to learning. Because I would argue that that's abnormal behavior. The fact that students are now claiming trigger warnings when 10 years ago they didn't, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, this was not a common practice. This was practically unheard of, if not done at all. Why now is there a surge of it? He presumes that because there's a surge of it, we need to have some studies done on their efficacy of having trigger warnings. Nope, we need to understand what's causing them. But as this paper has demonstrated, it's most likely because these students have taken a gender studies class or have drank the feminist Kool-Aid, and those are the students that are using it. And non-feminist or anti-feminist, but non-feminist, non-gender studies majors probably don't use trigger warnings at all. All right, so now this goes through 5 talking points, basically questions, but he doesn't have the answer to any of these questions, but rather saying these are questions that need to be asked. So he's trying to give us evidence for it, but more specifically, he's saying that there is no evidence for it. But he wants to give us 5 talking points to illustrate the fact that there are no talking points on this. Okay, so despite the scarcity of research on this question, how do students with trauma respond to trigger warnings? One case study at the University of Minnesota, including the perspective of 5 students, 2 teaching assistants, and 1 professor in a gender studies classroom, showed that trigger warnings didn't change students' appraisal towards course material. Instead, students' appraisal towards the professor became more favorable. So basically what it's saying is that a professor who uses trigger warnings become more popular. But again, you're talking about a study that had 5 students, 2 teaching assistant, and 1 professor, so 8 8 people constitutes enough of a pool of a study? No. You need at least a minimum of 50. And then I'm like, well, maybe there's something there. We need to do this on a larger scale. 100, 200, 1,000. That's a step in the right direction. 8? You've basically told me nothing here. Or rather, you told me, hey, when a professor does what the student wants, students like the professor more. Gee, I didn't know that. More research is needed, no, it's not, to address one of the fundamental questions surrounding trigger warnings, which concerns the action students take after exposure to trigger warnings. The multiplicity of outcomes following in class trigger warnings include, but are not limited to, leaving the classroom and not returning, leaving the classroom and returning once the upsetting material has passed, and staying for the discussion following mental preparation. So, and that's him moving the goalpost right there, basically saying that, if we do research in this, these are the three things that we need to discover about the effects of trigger warnings when students leave the classroom and don't come back, leave the classrooms and come back when the triggering content is done being discussed, and then just staying. Again, attacking the symptom, you're not looking at the overall problem. It's not like all of a sudden the law classes teach rape. They've been teaching it for a very long time. Collecting this data is without challenges, as there may be interdisciplinary and individual differences in the way instructors use trigger warnings. There will also be limitations in the ability of instructors for large classes to keep track of students' responses to trigger warning. For these reasons, similar surveys on students' experiences with trigger warnings should be included. Are you an idiot? No, no, seriously. Are you an idiot? Let's say for the fact that you're correct, that trigger warnings are a very legitimate thing, okay, and that it's necessary for the classroom. Your recommendation is that when someone has a triggering moment to content and feels the need to leave the classroom, you want the professor to follow that student and talk to them about the trigger warning, or even wait until after class and then go back and talk to them about it. Well, if the content caused them to be triggered, then doesn't talking about the triggering moment cause them to become triggered again? I mean, I see, it's just, it's hard to wrap my head around that, at least address that concern. Uh, I mean, yes, I understand that, you need to get evidence from them, but it's like, even by your own logic, you're requiring that students need to be triggered in order to discover something and then ask them questions about the triggering moment, which could then further trigger them. So basically, you'll never get any research done on this. They'll all be anecdotal. Plus the fact that given that, we're talking about anywhere from one student in an entire classroom to up to 30% of a classroom, you're probably not going to get enough done unless you mandate that all professors and students talk about it after the fact. And even then, I wouldn't trust the results because, you know, if the person is using it as a means of control, they'll say whatever they want. And if it's being disseminated from gender studies, then gender studies professors across the board will be able to say, hey, this is what you say in this situation. Given the adequate sample size of surveys, This data would move beyond anecdotal support. The data would begin to provide support for theories of academia like LaGuardia, who claim that far from allowing students to skip content, the warning enables students to participate in all content. Lukanoff, who suggests that the concept of trigger warnings is misguided because it helps students avoid their fears instead of confronting them in a safe classroom setting. Well, see, and here's what Chu's doing again. He's saying, well, if we actually analyze this, then we'll find the evidence we need. Rather than saying, hey, let's actually do a survey on this. Let's actually do a study on this and see where the data goes. See if it actually is helping students, or are students using it as a way to avoid their fears, using it as a way to avoid the classroom. You know, and I'm open to that. Let's do a study on this. Let's see where it actually falls. Let's do an honest to God study on this that follows the metrics of the scientific method. Hey, we have an observation. People are using trigger warnings in the classroom. Let's understand that more. Let's form a hypothesis. Let's test that hypothesis. Let's see if we can find any problems with the assumptions that are used. Oh, we found some. Let's go back to the drawing board and keep doing it until we can have a theory about this and see where that falls. No, Chu says, let's do the study, so we can find evidence to support that trigger warnings are necessary and ignore any naysayers. Now, Slaughter and Newman suggest that the distinction needs to be made between three types of warnings that are often used interchangeably: advisory, inappropriate content by age; content, offensive and graphic content; and trigger warnings, content for sufferers of trauma. Well, inappropriate by age, I mean, we're talking about college students who are anywhere from 18 to 40. I mean, they're appropriate for the age, I mean, maybe you might have some younger children in there, like 15 or whatever, who's going to college, but they are the vast minority. Most are starting college around 18 to 22. You need content warnings of offensive or graphic content. Okay. Well, that's what PG, PG-13, rated R, NC-17 are. I mean, that doesn't really help because the MPAA is very corrupt, and then trigger warnings. Mann suggests that trigger warnings are similar to advisory warnings frequently observed in movies and television shows. Similarly, Groot conceptualizes the warnings and give as advisory warnings, where students are advised about the nature of the course content as opposed to being warned about triggers. So say, hey, we have some content in this classroom. Just be aware of it, rather than say, hey, this will cause you a trigger, this will cause you a trigger, and this will cause you a trigger. LaGuardia's content warnings provide a form of informed consent towards engaging in potentially distressing content. Signing up for a course is informed consent to be taught that information, even if you disagree with it, even if you find it disturbing. By the way, people have used trigger warnings as a means of winning arguments, of saying they don't agree with something, and that saying that a student is wrong is triggering. Especially when we have terms like mansplaining, manspreading, manterrupting, and that if a male professor does this to a female student, then she can be triggered. Oh, you just triggered me because you just interrupted me and disagreed with me. I can't be in this class anymore. You need to give me an A so I don't tell your superiors and get you fired. I don't think that's happened, but I could see it actually happening. The overall from section 2 highlights the difficulties in discerning whether professors are giving advisory content or trigger warnings without going into specific wording of the warning. This paper suggests that the nature of warnings, frequency, and format should be included as category for data collection. So it's not enough that professors are giving them, it's that they also need to record what it is that they specifically said and make sure that they are using the correct type of warning in the discussion. Although there is no research documenting measurable outcomes from exposure to trigger warnings, i.e., anxiety levels, there is limited research on the effect of advisory warnings in media. Oh, I think I love this part. For television warnings, studies have shown that viewership and viewer interest increase in the presence of advisory warnings. So at this point, he's basically going to go into the discussion about how viewership. Well, when we started having TV ratings like DSV, drug, sex, violence, um, sexual content, not necessarily sex, but when these references, when we see them for the TV, it actually started to increase viewership. People were more inclined to see a particular show because it had those things in it. But it's just like video games. I mean, when you put a rating on something, and this actually happened to the game Oblivion, um, Elder Scrolls Oblivion. It originally had like I think a PG rating, but then, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but then it was discovered that there was like files on the game itself that they were hidden files. They were locked away. I mean, you had to use special software to find it, but there was nude content on there, like skins to put nudes on characters. And it went from that to a mature rating from PG to M. And because now it was an M game, people actually took more interest in Oblivion than before. So there's something to be said that if something, requires a warning like that, people are more interested in it. However, he's comparing apples and oranges here. The limited research on television advisory warnings and informing the trigger warning conversation should be tempered because television warnings are far removed from classroom warnings. The differences can be categorized as motivation of the participant, learning versus leisure, nature of the content, academic versus recreational, frequency of warning, before content delivery versus throughout content, content of the warnings, general warning versus picking out specific scenes, themes, and words, delivery medium, written versus verbal. So that's a very valid point, and why we can't really compare television content warnings or even movie content warnings versus trigger warnings in the classroom. Because in the classroom, it's a learning environment, academic environment. Warnings are given throughout the discussion of the content, and it's verbal versus television that's leisure, recreational. Warnings are given at the front of it, and it's a written rather than a verbal, although sometimes it can be verbal. So yeah, you're comparing apples and oranges here. You can't take one and say this is evidence thereof, which I give him credit for. He does point this out. Regardless of the type of warning, research should explore the psychological changes and responses resulting from the student's choice of action. Only then can we begin to establish whether these warnings have positive effects or any negative effects at all on short and long term students' mental health outcomes. Boysen proposes a basic experimentation for testing the effectiveness of trigger warnings by exposing subject groups containing students who are randomly assigned trigger warnings or no trigger warnings to a range of potentially triggering topics. So you want to purposely trigger students. On a preliminary level, differences in measuring for anxiety, arousal, and mood, again, Oxford comma, look into it. Recorded pre and post exposure should provide a primary indication of whether trigger warnings have a positive effect. Brigdland and Nakarangi have started a project on open science framework which seeks to examine whether a warning for potentially distressing memory tasks will allow the individual to channel their inner resources to help process the memories with minimum distress compared to those with warnings. Measured for mood, state of anxiety, and the details of memory, the certainty of memory to their identity, the impact of memory, intrusive, and reported coping strategies are recorded twice, 2 weeks apart at points after individuals perform memory tasks. The finding of this study will shed some light on the impact of trigger warnings in cases where students choose not to excuse themselves and carry on engaging with the potentially distressing material. I think it's actually going to say a lot more than that. It will help us understand trauma and being in an environment where memory is necessary, and could even help us better understand how to help people with post traumatic stress disorder. And he's saying the only value that this has is whether or not how students cope with stress in the classroom. No, this exam would have wider applications than that. So, skipping that, we'll go to do individuals with trauma coping using the same methods? Yeah, it's poorly written right there. Bonanno, and honestly, get this proofread or get grammarly.com. That can help you out right there. Bonanno, suggests that resilience characterize. Actually, I'm going to skip that because I put that in blue. I thought that was just completely unnecessary to put in there. He suggests the assumption that a majority of people will have prolonged distress and impaired function following a traumatic event should be challenged, and that the diverse pathways to building resistance include, but are not limited to, hardiness, self enhancement, repressive coping, positive emotion, and laughing. So his point is that we shouldn't shelter people from things that could cause triggers. People need to learn to cope with it. They need to learn to handle it. And that's why psychiatrists tell those with PTSD who have triggering events learn how to work with them, how to work in society despite having the trigger warnings, because the world's not going to change for you. You've got to adapt yourself to the needs of the world around you. And yes, trigger warnings are tough to deal with. They are rather severe. At the same time, though, if you are being coddled all the time, you will never grow as a person. You will always just be a ticking time bomb when it comes to trigger warnings. And you'll never really be a person at that point. I'm not saying people who have trigger warnings are not people. I'm saying people who do nothing to try to help themselves are not people. I'm someone who suffered a traumatic brain injury. My head gets hit, and suddenly I'm disabled for the rest of my life. I have difficulty watching football because every time a football player takes a hit, I just sit there and think, what if he got a concussion right then and there? What if that changes his whole life? It brings me back to the moment when I got hit, and it greatly stresses me out. Now, I don't think of that as a trigger necessarily because I don't have PTSD. And while it was a traumatic event, but it's still like it kind of raises the hairs on the back of my neck. That said, though, I'm not going to demand that the world stop playing football. I'm not going to demand that players, you know, do anything about me. It's me who has the problem. It's me who has to work with the rest of the world. And every now and then I watch football because, maybe I'm at a bar and it's playing and it's in my eyesight. And I'm not going to ask the bar to turn it off to appease me. I could also just move, but it's not that big of a deal to me. I can occasionally watch football, and while yes, I have a problem with it, I mean, if anything, it's helping me. It's helping me be able to build coping strategies when I'm watching something like that. Same thing with wrestling too. And I used to be big fans of wrestling and football. Studies have shown that resilience is not uncommon following traumatic events such as sexual victimization and subsequent re-victimization. Walsh estimates that of re-victimized population, 72% of adolescents, 55% of home residing women, and 40% of college women did not report lifetime PTSD symptoms, while 80% of adolescents and housing residents and 68% of college women did not report past 6 months of PTSD symptoms. These findings highlight that resilience following sexual victimization and re-victimization is not uncommon. Funny that they didn't really test men in this one, but maybe they didn't have access to men because we're told that we can't be raped. But I mean, this right here indicates that majority of people do not have PTSD when facing a traumatic event. It also states that those who do don't have PTSD past 6 months, that the brain is quite capable of building resistance to the trauma. So as you can see, there's just a lot of this pink throughout this section. I mean, that's almost 2 pages worth. So let's go this. Increased resilience as measured by Connor Davidson Resilience Scale, CDRS, has been shown to be predictive on a higher prospect of recovery in PTSD patients. Anyard and Cantor found that among college students who were trauma survivors, those with active internal locus of control over external events and greater optimism towards trauma as an opportunity for growth were shown to be more resilient based on measures of academia, social, and personal emotional adjustments. And that might be an argument. Well, see, that's proof, if students can control their environment and when a trigger warning comes, they can just run away, that's control. No, that's not control. That's the opposite of control. That's running away from it. Running away from something, no one would agree that that is a form of control because all you're doing is feeding into um, your fear and you're not building coping mechanisms for that. For coping strategies, Campbell Sills found that in a sample of college student, task oriented coping was indicative of higher resistance as measured by CDRS compared to emotional oriented coping, which was characteristically of low resilience. Boom, right there. Task oriented coping versus emotional oriented coping. Emotional oriented coping is characteristically of low resilience. That if people use emotions as a means of coping strategy, hey, I'm triggered, I'm going to leave and cry, that's going to result in low resilience to the trauma. However, if you do tasks to help you cope with something, you have a greater chance of building a resilience. Now, Schneider reported that avoidant emotional coping as a significant predictor of complicated grief and PTSD in college students following the traumatic loss of someone close. So, yeah, well, people do have PTSD, and college students are more than capable of having PTSD for actual traumatic things. Just having someone say something bad to you on Twitter does not constitute PTSD. Having a professor disagree with you does not constitute PTSD. But I will admit that anyone can get PTSD, but studies have shown, at least amongst women, that most in a traumatic event do not develop PTSD, and those that do doesn't last for any longer than 6 months. Repressive coping characterize as individuals with self-reporting, high defensiveness, low trait anxiety, and high anxiety-related arousal is a common coping mechanism among victims of child sex abuse (CSA) and sexual assault. So, yeah, that confirms what I know. People are highly defensive. They have high anxiety. Alston suggests that repressive copers may be motivated by their self-protection to avoid anxiety, including experiences. And what this is saying here is, when people are dealing with triggers, it really activates their amygdala. And he kind of goes into the science of this a little bit, which we won't really review. But you have something in your brain called the amygdala. You actually have two amygdala that serve different purposes, but they're mostly related around emotions. And any stimulation you receive in your life, when it comes into your brain, it goes through your amygdala first before it goes to the rest of your brain. Now, your brain, a mature adult brain, and we're talking about anyone who's the age of 25 and over, when you actually become an adult. At that point, you hold on, sorry, I've lost my thought. Yes, amygdalas. Okay, so when your brain takes it, it's able to delegate it, put it to other parts of your brains to deal with. However, if the amygdala, which is connected to your hippocampus, which deals with memory and emotion as well, if it's like, hey, I recognize this, you know, stimulation and there's an associated emotion with it, it will do what's called an amygdala hijack, where basically the amygdala hijacks your entire brain and forces it to deal with the stimuli in a very specific way. This is also known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. Basically, you're dealing with a situation and you're full of fear, you're full of anxiety. You know, maybe you want to run away, which is very common. Maybe um you want to fight back against the thing that's causing you stress, or maybe you just freeze and you can't move. This is a very real thing. And that's basically what they're talking about here, is the fight, flight, or freeze response, or the amygdala hijack. When your brain is hijacked based on emotional stimuli that causes fear or anxiety. Doesn't happen every time you have fear, but if it's related to something traumatic or a phobia, it's more likely to happen. Previous research have shown that repressive copers demonstrated significantly greater ability in suppressing native autobiographical memories, thoughts, and self related materials compared to non repressive copers. So basically, people who are repressive in their coping strategies are more capable of, ignoring anything negative and only focusing on the positive. I'm thinking of that scene in Me, Myself, and Irene, where they're talking about some of his mental conditions, and he talks about how he has selective hearing, and she's like, she said something about it, and what he heard is his response is, "Yeah, I usually get my hair cut at least once a year," or something like that. He didn't even really hear what she said. He thought he heard something else and responded to that. I don't know if that's on the same level as this, but yeah, it makes sense that if you're coping with trauma, that you're more likely to ignore anything negative about yourself, and you're more likely to believe that you have anything that you think or feel is automatically validated because you believe it, that you don't seek outside validation. It's also called self-serving bias, that you yourself can never be wrong, that if you're wrong, it's because someone else is at fault. A good example of that would be if you've ever watched Kitchen Nightmares. All of those people have self-serving bias. They're like, well, that's not my fault, especially Amy Baking Company. It's like, people on Reddit are just angry. They're just trying to destroy me. Even when people specifically complain, hey, this food is bad, they're like, no, you're the problem. We'll call you must leave, or we'll call the police. That's self-serving bias. That's what's being described here, is ignoring any negative autobiographical information. I should have become a psychologist, in all honesty. I think I missed my calling in life. Just checking right now to make sure this is still recording. Okay, cool. Suggests that because repression is an unconscious process, repressive copers can alleviate distress without burning significant cognitive resources, leaving them with greater capability of employing problem solving over emotionally focused strategies in dealing with traumatic events. Repressive copers have been demonstrated to use active coping strategies, positive thoughts, in high threat situations, and passive attentional avoidance in low threat situations. Now, repressive coping, I know I kind of suggest that it might have been a negative thing, but it's neither positive or negative. It's just the human condition that if we're kind of using coping mechanisms that are under the surface, that they're kind of repressive, we might ignore negative details about ourselves and focus on the positive, which can be beneficial, but if done to an extreme, can be extremely bad. But this is saying here that, those who repressive copers can adopt more easily adopt active coping strategies. And in the end, when you're dealing with trauma, the most important thing is that you can find a method of happiness and move forward. And I have that myself with the abuse that I suffered at the hands of my ex-girlfriend. I'm choosing every day I'm choosing not to focus on that, to put it out of my mind. It's always present there. I want to take it out of my mind so I can move forward. The abuse she did to me was hard and it's still having its effect on me, but I'm repressing that. I'm using coping strategies of repression so I can move forward. Now, I'm smart enough to know the dangers of self-serving bias, and I try very, very hard not to do it. But it is still a challenge. So, it's not that there's one right way to deal with trauma, but there are a lot of bad ways to deal with trauma. Okay, compared to repression, suppress defined by the DSM as defense mechanism in which a person intentionally avoids thinking about disturbing problems, desires, feelings, or experiences is a conscious process commonly employed in avoidant coping. Well, and it might sound like what I deal with my ex is suppression. I think it's repression. It's open for a discussion on that. But I don't do it as a defense mechanism. That if someone brought it up to me, I try to turn the tables on them and put it onto them for even bringing it up. I'll be like, hey, it happened. Okay, I don't think about it. It's better that I just put it out of my mind so I can move forward. But it's still in my mind. I do still think about it quite often. But I don't employ defensive mechanisms in order to avoid it. Okay, so however, the use of these trigger warnings in the classroom, I think, would be identified as suppression because they're being used as defense mechanisms. Like, oh, I'm triggered by what you're talking about, so I'm going to leave. That's a defense mechanism. And one of the ways in which we become fully realized people is that we need to overcome our defensive mechanisms. Saz found that depressive rumination, the process in which one turns one attention to the causes and consequences of depressive symptoms, mediates the impact of thought suppression. Saz, I hope I'm saying that right, suggests that when attempts to alleviate depressive rumination by thought suppression fails, rumination thoughts may increase in frequency. Thus, engaging in chronic thought suppression may ironically increase sensitive to ruminated thoughts. As smart as I am, I didn't understand a whole lot from this. All right, so these two people, Burwell and Skirk, differentiated two dimensions of rumination: passive brooding, characterized by strategies of avoidance, denial, and fleeing, compared to active self reflection, which is reflected in problem solving and cognitive restructuring. Burwell and Skirk found that passive brooding was indicative of depressive symptoms in adolescence, while active self-reflection did not, providing support for the suggestion that brooding falls within the category of maladaptive coping strategies. So, when people are dealing with something, they can either be a passive brooding person who's avoiding denial or fleeing from something, or they can actively self-reflect on the trauma that they've dealt with, which helps them with problem solving and cognitive restructuring of the brain to deal with the trauma. And that the first one is, maladaptive coping strategies. So that's actually a case against trigger warnings in the classroom. And it's like Chu doesn't even, really talk about this. He just puts that out there saying, hey, this is what these people discovered. Now watch me ignore it altogether. Chu needs to deal with this thought right here because it makes perfect sense. If you're doing everything you can avoid that causes you stress, that's maladaptive. You will never get better. You need to learn to have, active self-reflection, be able to work through the trauma. I believe that's what I'm trying to do with the trauma I've suffered. As I'm learning to work with it, I actively self-reflect. I actively look at the situation and try to understand it and ask myself if there is something I could have done to avoid it. I have a lot of answers for what I could have done to avoid it, but I also see myself as being able to avoid it in the future and what signs I need to look for if that situation ever happens. That's me actively reflecting on what happened to me versus just trying to pretend it didn't happen or run away whenever someone wants to talk about it. Experimental avoidance, defined as attempt to alter the form, frequency, or situation sensitivity of private events, even when doing so causes behavioral harm, is categorized as emotional regulation strategy. Hayes suggests that while experimental avoidance is perpetrated and reinforced through cultural context, places the focus on feeling good and avoidance of pain, the functional significance of avoided events is amplified as efforts for emotional control begin to interfere with daily functioning. Individuals whose primary motivators are pain avoidance and feeling good may experience a narrowing of behavior repertoire and may find it constraining to act following their environment, what their environment affords. So this was a lot of talk, but what I'm taking away from this is that experimental avoidance, attempt to alter the form, frequency, or situation sensitivity of private events, basically avoidance. You want to change the world around you to accommodate your trauma, what you experience, and what should be avoided in the effort to feel good. Now, feeling good is important, don't get me wrong. But if your life is spent on avoiding pain and always feeling good, meaning that you're not dealing with anything ever, then you have a limitation in how you can interact with the environment around you, because anything that upsets you, you want to run away from or try to change according to your specific needs. And that's going to prevent you from experiencing a lot of things in life. As Wesley said in The Princess Bride, life is pain. Anyone who says different is trying to sell you something. You can't avoid pain. Pain is a part of being human. Pain is part of being alive. We've all gone through pain. And yes, sometimes our ability to cope with it is not as strong as other people, but we do need to learn how to cope with it. That's why we have therapists and psychologists. Not all of them are winners, but search around and you might find someone who can help you cope and not just tell you that the world around you needs to change, but that you need to change, that you need to learn how to overcome. Sorry for the sniffles. Cashton found that experimental avoidance mediated the effects of maladaptive coping on anxiety related stress, anxiety sensitivity, trait anxiety, suffocation fears, body sensation fears, and emotional regulation on negative and positive experiences in daily life. Experiential, I keep saying experimental, but experiential avoidance was associated with less positive affective experience, healthy life appraisals, positive events, and greater frequency of negative affective experience and negative life events. That right there. If you're busy running away from everything in your life, you will never take a chance of being happy. Your life will always be miserable. You've got to, and it's not easy. I understand that. I understand that better than most people, but you've got to be able to try to take a chance on life. Take a chance that, yeah, this might seem, like it could lead to you getting hurt, but sometimes you need to be put into the path of the train as it charges at you to have a good moment. That maybe that train is going to stop before it hits you. You can't live your life of saying that every event is that train coming at you and you need to just run away. Sometimes you need to stay on the tracks and let it come. It's not easy. No, I'm not saying it is. Ooh, Wikipedia snap it. The name Cezanne sounds familiar. There's a Thomas Cezanne who wrote The Myth of Mental Illness. Well, maybe that's who it is. I mean, it doesn't give us first names at all. All right. Study sampling adult, college, and treatment-seeking incarcerated and veteran and CSA victims found that those who employed avoidant coping strategies over the long term indicated a greater likelihood of developing PTSD symptoms and other problems such as substance abuse. Speaks to what the last one said. If you're constantly avoiding, then you're going to do everything you can to avoid dealing with that trauma. I mean, I knew that when the abuse happened, and my ex, like, well, we should still remain friends. I want to remain friends. It's like, if we're going to be friends, then I need a way of coping with everything that happened to me. I need some positive experiences. We need to go out. We need to do something. We need to build new, good memories. I didn't want to avoid it. If I was going to have her in my life, despite this abuse, because I was still with her for a month. I mean, if I could have left right then and there, I would have, but I didn't have that opportunity. And she really stressed that she was sorry and that she wanted, but she didn't want to do anything to help me cope with the trauma of what I dealt with. And maybe, just maybe, if she, made some extra effort to help me in my coping of the situation, help me form new good memories, we could still be friends right now. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, anyone who deals with something traumatic, who doesn't deal with it, who wants to run away from it and pretend it doesn't happen, are more likely to develop PTSD. And what's worse is that, it takes men a little bit of time to really rationalize with what's happened to them. Their brains are able to put stuff aside and not ever deal with it. And then when it finally hits them hard, but then there are no services to help them out. So that is why men are more likely to develop PTSD. That's why men are more likely to develop substance abuse compared to women. This is some really good stuff that he's putting in this, and I wish that he put this in his analysis of trigger warnings. Because this right here is saying that trigger warnings are actually the worst thing you can do for someone. Sikema demonstrated that the reduction in the use of avoidant coping strategies over a 1-year period in participants with HIV and child sex abuse histories resulted in significant decrease of traumatic stress. Together, the studies above highlight the diversity and complexity of coping strategies, along with some of their advantages and drawbacks. Data on the different actions that students take following trigger warnings will determine the role of trigger warnings within a landscape of scientifically demonstrated adaptive and maladaptive coping strategies. I'm sorry to say the data is already there. He's wanting it done specifically for students in college classes who use trigger warnings. But I'm sorry to say the evidence is already there. Just because it's not specific for college students in a fucking college classroom doesn't mean that there's no evidence. There is evidence there. We just went through many different sources that demonstrate what maladaptive coping strategies are, and using trigger warnings and running from the classroom in tears is a maladaptive coping strategy. He is completely ignoring that information that he just presented and said, well, there's no evidence. We need to find some evidence. Wikipedia snippet. The highway to hell is paved with good intentions. There's another saying that's like that. I think it's the path to hell is paved with good intentions. That's the one I heard. Which, you know, so let's read on here. It is unclear if trigger warnings promote resilience because there's no data on the mental health outcomes of students who use trigger warnings as a method to aid in coping in both classroom and non-classroom settings. Yes, there is. You just choose to ignore it. It's also important to consider whether the arbitrary implementation of trigger warnings on material to material basis, use some fucking dashes, undermines what Bonanno and Mancini describe as the natural heterogeneity of human stress responding, by assuming that all students with trauma in their classroom will benefit and wish to be subject to warnings for potentially distressing material. Here's where it gets good. Regardless of whether they choose to ignore the warnings, individuals with trauma who do not want to be subjected to warnings in the first place may see this as an encroachment on their autonomy in dealing with their trauma. I put this in purple for a very specific reason. Now, what Chu has been trying to suggest here, when I look at his bigger picture, he's saying that a minority of students want trigger warnings. Those who are in humanities, those who most likely take in some sort of gender studies program or are a feminist or social justice warrior in some way, request for trigger warnings. At best, I see about 30% of students want this. And he's saying, and we need to find evidence to support this. So not only can we get it in those specific classrooms, but across college education as a whole. Now, you can point out that it's a minority of students, but his side would basically say, well, just because it's a minority doesn't mean that, you know, they should be ignored. And I can agree with that. But then we come to the point that those who are suffering trauma who are trying to find coping strategies that they may not want to have reminders of trigger warnings. They may not want reminders of content warnings that something could cause triggers, something could cause additional trauma or relapsing in their trauma, and that hearing it could cause triggering. And the my opposition would probably say, well, yeah, but they only represent a very small percentage. They're a minority. If I'm meant to pay attention to the minority of students who want trigger warnings in the classroom, then why should I ignore the small percentage, the vast minority? I'll agree it probably is a vast minority, but let's just say minority because we don't have a number to support how many of these students are like this. Why then am I supposed to ignore that minority in favor of the minority of your side? And this is very important right here. I'm supposed to give in to the students who want a trigger warning and change the needs of the majority for the needs of the minority, but ignore another minority who may not want it in the first place and hinders their active coping strategies. You know, and as they say, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. Whatever is good for one, it's good for the other. If I'm supposed to take on the mantle of the minority and change it for the majority, then shouldn't I also do that for the other minority in this discussion? Well, change it for all of those who want a trigger warning, and then change it for those that don't, that do actually have trauma. So there you go. But again, he's just going to whitewash this. He's just going to push it away and ignore it when he discusses anything else. Okay, I think I'm good on time here. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop it at this point. I've probably been going for about 90 minutes. There's just a lot to this paper. Hell, we're not even we're not even a third done with this. So I think that's a good point to leave off of. That, you know, there are going to be some people there that have active coping strategies that are trying to push forward. They're doing their own therapy, but when they come to the classroom, it's not a time for therapy. It's a time to learn. And yes, they might deal with something that causes them stress, but they need to learn to deal with that stress in an active way. And being told, hey, this is a trigger warning. Hey, this could cause this trigger. Hey, by the way, let me pay special attention to this trigger warning may undo some of the therapies that they're working with. All because someone else says they have trauma and want to avoid it at all possible. They want to use avoidant coping mechanisms, which will never help them as a whole. And Chu is basically saying there's no evidence, there's no studies on what happens to students that do these things, when in fact there are. In fact, he's presented studies that demonstrate what it is. And more than likely, if an actual study was done on these students, I mean an actual study, what would be found? What would be found would support what these other studies have found, that avoidant personality, avoidant coping mechanisms lead to maladaptive lives. Now, we are talking about a phenomenon that only started 3 years ago. And if we were to actually do a study on this, we would need to be able to track someone over several different years. You know, at least 10 years. We need to be able to track their progress to see how their life turned out as a result. And we wouldn't need just 10 or 15 people. We'd need at least 100 people. But the problem is it's only been around for a short time, so we can't really get that data right now. And if this were to be a college-wide mandated change based on a scientific paper, it probably won't come for at least 10 to 15 years. However, I have a feeling that, Mr. Chu here and all of those in gender studies can't wait that long and will expect it to change immediately. So, I mean, you see the small example here. He just says, hey, here's what the opposition says. I'm going to ignore it, and this is what I think. Here, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Ugh, let me turn this on. There we go. Actually, it doesn't help that much. So, I thank you for watching. As I said, this will be a multi-part video. But it's so surprising how easy it is for him to just ignore the evidence he puts up himself. Hell, if he had put nothing up about the opposition, like, well, there's nothing there, and just not do it. I mean, it's intellectually dishonest, but at least I give him that he put the opposition up. However, while he did put the opposition up, he also chose to ignore it for everything else. I mean, yeah, there is no studies on students dealing with, trigger warnings in the classroom. That's only because it's been something around for the last few years. But at the same time, we have a lot of studies that do tell us what, happens when people employ maladaptive coping strategies. And that these trigger warnings in the classroom are maladaptive. Now, he keeps saying, well, these aren't maladaptive. It allows the students to engage it. That's an opinion, which so far doesn't support what we have seen in the news media, that people are using it as a way to censor their professors, a way to try to censor Christina Hoff Sommers at a talk, saying, my dog is triggered by you, as a way to avoid classes, as a way to change the curriculum around what you want. That is not active engagement. That's the exact opposite. And he has not demonstrated in any way that people have used trigger warnings as a way to engage. He's only said, well, this person over here said it, so it must be true. So we need to do research so we can do this, this, and this and get it done. Show me the evidence. Show me that actually works. But more importantly, take a step back and actually show me, not show me. Take a step back and look at it from the perspective, why in the last 3 years has this emerged? I mean, take modern academia. It has existed since, I'll say since the 60s. And it's nearly 2020 now. So we're talking about the modern system has existed for 80 years. And in that 80 years, only in the last 3 years has this existed. I mean, since then, we've had second wave feminism. And this was never a problem back then. And there's a lot of claims that society was a lot worse back then. I can agree that it was a lot worse back then than it is today. And yet, only in the last 3 years has this become a problem. Let's study the underlying cause of this new surge of trigger warnings that wasn't existent in the last 80 years. It's not even 1%. It's not even 10% of that. It's like 5% of that entire time. Actually, it's probably less than that. I'm not so good on doing math quick in my head. We're talking about a small fraction of the time of the modern system. Doesn't that cause for concern? It causes me concern. And it makes me think that this is all bupkis. This is all bullshit. This is just people trying to control the environment according to their political viewpoints. That's all it is. Well, that's my rant. So I thank you for coming out for this video. Please subscribe down below. I guess there's some sort of notification bell now. I'm not really sure what that is. As I said, YouTube's no longer going to give me money for my YouTube videos. Not that they ever did. God knows I deserve it. But I am still doing Patreon. I'm doing a very secret project I'm hoping to have released by the end of the week, if not next week. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be good. But, you know, donate to my Patreon down below. I am saving up for a computer, a modern computer. It doesn't even have to be new, but just something. I would prefer a newer computer. I prefer a brand new computer, but you know, I want to do video rendering. I want to do better YouTube videos for you. I want to do online courses. You know, there's so much. My life would be so much improved if I had a modern computer. My current computer is actually in Philadelphia right now, Pennsylvania, and that computer is not that great. It really can't do the rendering that I need. And this computer is a laptop, and it's on its way out. I've had it for over 2 years, and I got it refurbished. That's about the life expectancy of a laptop, in all honesty. So I'll probably need a new laptop eventually. But this one serves me for basic needs. But if you can help me out all, you know, I want to get a laptop, get health insurance. Right now, it just kind of helps me with the day-to-day things. But if I can actually get some money together to get a computer,